Good evening. Last spring, while touring Spain and Portugal, I was introduced over dinner to the well-known Lisbonese novelist, João Isidoro Jiménez. To my embarrassment, at that time, I had read only a small fraction of Senor Jiménez's vast corpus of work, which for the most part is written in a comically exaggerated vernacular difficult to translate into English, but which I am assured by my Portuguese friends is screamingly funny. But my unfamiliarity with his work was no barrier to conversation with the garrulous Senor, a small, thick-spectacled elderly gentleman, fond of scallops, ginginha, and incomprehensible Portuguese puns. Over the long, relaxed meal, I heard his story. In 1967, as a young man in the last days of the Salazar regime, Senor Jiménez had been imprisoned for 10 months, during which time he was severely beaten by the guards, losing sight completely in one eye. The vision in the second eye was also partly compromised. As a consequence, upon his release, he was no longer able to drive a car, not that he could have afforded one at the time, and was forced to travel to his job as a postal worker on the autobus. The commute was not long, about a half hour each way, but it soon became tedious, and to pass the time, Senor Jiménez began to compose, first in his head, and later in imitation of his beloved Vladimir Nabokov on a series of index cards, the outline of what became his first novel, the culture clash comedy, The Señorita in Salt Lake City. Having acquired this habit, he never shook it, and in this way, he wrote for a half hour twice a day, 48 weeks of the year, acknowledging his 4 weeks of vacation during which he would visit his sister's family in the Algarve, the 41 novels and 8 story collections that constitute his output. These books, available in every bookstore and train station in Portugal, but largely unknown on this side of the Atlantic, include such bestsellers as Don Federico and the Lord, There Is No Mother Left Here, Riberosa Rim Job, the Jose Saramago Literary Prize winner, The Midnight Meal, My Best Abortion, Fascist Follies 1933, and The Rapey Chicken. They are read by all classes of citizen, men and women, rich and poor, right and left wing, and some of the less salacious ones, like Bernardo XYZ, are frequently taught in middle school. But of his many awards and accolades, the Senor seemed most proud of his special pass granted by the city of Lisbon in 1990 that has allowed him to ride all buses and trains free since that time. One of the few men left sitting with us, it was growing late and most of our table mates had left, leaned forward at this point and said something I couldn't catch. Senor Jiménez translated for me, "It's an old joke. He says it's unfair I owe him half my royalties, so at least I can pay for dinner." "And why is that?" I asked. "Because it was he and some of his friends who beat me during those days at the Fortaleza de Peniche. He says I would never have gotten where I am without him." I found this hard to believe, but they both assured me it was so. Senor Camara had indeed been one of the fortress guards, as was the late Senor Roja, at whose wedding Jiménez had been best man. Further, he had a nodding acquaintance with 2 or 3 other former guards who still lived in Lisbon, although many had died over the years, and one, the notorious Pisquera, had been assassinated in 1974, a spectacular incident that formed the basis for Jiménez's novel Incineração de Senor Cabral, later serialized in the Los Angeles Free Press under the title Burning Mr. Fucker. How was it, I asked, that they were able to put such an awful history behind them? Senor Camara waved off my question, saying in effect that it was all a long time ago, but Jiménez's answer was more interesting. He expressed a sort of, I suppose you could call it, systems-type view of human beings, one in which there was little room for personal recrimination. To his way of thinking, human beings were little more than a collection of easily identifiable drives for security, sex, self-expression, ego-stroking, and so on. When those drives were deployed in concordant ways within a healthy system, all was well. But when the timetables were wrong, when the engines were not serviced, when drivers ignore the traffic lights, then disaster. Well, This might be true as far as it went, but I've been around the block a few times myself, and I know when I'm being fucked with. This was cornball wisdom, probably something that Senor Jimenez had used on 100 journalists over the years who would go back to their editors with 100 variations on the same story about a society as a mode of public transit, perfected within a novelist's imagination and able to reconcile one to a painful past. My skepticism must have shown on my face because both of the senors burst out laughing, and we moved on to talking about the waitresses. The explanation for this curious friendship, if indeed there is any meaningful explanation, was never forthcoming. Just last week, I received a pre-release copy of Senor Jimenez's most recent novel, The Lecture Tour, which features as its hero a pompous middle-aged professor who travels the world bloviating about all manner of nonsense to a bemused audience of far more interesting people. It reminded me of the novels of David Lodge, and naturally, I was flattered. Senor Jimenez also has the habit of giving out, in lieu of autographs, some of the original index cards on which he writes his first drafts, and one was included in the package he sent me. It contains a version of the book's first paragraph, which reads as follows. Professor Pyle, traveling abroad, apologized at every step for his country, as if every American sin was his own. The ladies of Lisbon would tease him to his face, but defend him to their boyfriends, telling them, at least he takes an interest. You've never set foot outside the Barrio Alto. The boyfriends said the professor was a sex fiend, a pervert and a molester, and that they would beat him up and he would enjoy it. But they did not do that. And the ladies kept attending the professor's lectures and asking him double-edged questions that made him look bad to his audience. And afterward, in his hotel room, the professor would think of them and masturbate. In the final published version, this was considerably toned down and read only, Professor Pyle, traveling abroad, looked out the bus window at all the lovely women and wished he spoke their language. Senor Jimenez is elderly, and my friends have quietly told me he is not in the best of health. I would never have known. The evening I spent in his company is one of my most treasured memories. The senor was sharp and shrewd and lively, without the hint of a shadow upon him. Whatever his secret, it seems to have worked for him. We should all be so lucky. He has lived his life as a constant comedy, and I have no doubt that when that final tragic day at last arrives, Senor Jimenez will die laughing. Thank you.